Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Forward Physio. If you don't know who I am, my name is Noah Mandel. I'm a Canadian physiotherapist, and I like to speak to experts from around the world in our space so that we can learn from them. If you are looking at the video version of this podcast, welcome to my new office. I've been painting the walls and renovating and decorating and building furniture. And now my own office is set up and I'll be running my own practice out of here. So that is why I haven't posted a podcast in a while. Anyway, today's podcast was with Jared Boyd, and we recorded it about a month and a half ago. Looking back, this was easily one of my favorite conversations that I've had to date on Forward Physio. I think some people in pro sports get to where they are in their field mostly due to their relationships and their ability to network and communicate and connect with others. And while that may have served Jared, I'm not sure. I can definitely tell you he's also where he is because of his intellect and his ability to explain his thinking and his overall knowledge when it comes to rehab. He is the director of rehab for the Memphis Grizzlies in the NBA. And I think that the Memphis Grizzlies are in excellent hands. But what do I know? Today's conversation was largely about the functional versus non-functional exercise debate as it pertains to rehab and as it pertains to rehabbing NBA players. I felt like I could have had this conversation all day with Jared, and we had to stop it short at one point. But with that said, we do go pretty in depth. So I get it if it's a lot and you may want to chunk up your listening into different segments or rewind at certain points. But again, this was easily one of my favorite conversations that I've had so far. So I really hope you enjoy it and I hope you learn something. I know I did. And without further ado, I bring to you my conversation with Jared Boyd. Jared, you are a thinker that I really, really respect in this space. And I want people to have a good idea about who you are as an individual before we dive into today's topic. So, what are some beliefs or character traits that really help to illustrate who you are as a rehab professional?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate you, Noah. And that's a great question. I actually like that one for like a intro, if you will, to the conversation. I've never been asked that before, so um, probably the first thing that comes to mind, and it's a concept that I got from Adam Grant, his book Think Again, that I thought did a good job in maybe encapsulating like who I am as a person, and it's like this confident humility as a clinician. I think
Mm.
maybe having both of those merged together does a great job of just illustrating who I am, but also who I want to continue to evolve towards. And what I mean is that, you have the confidence in your current capabilities as a clinician, as a person, as a provider, but then also the humility to maybe step back and say, what are some of the things that I can continue to advance in, that I can continue to evolve in, as well as look to others or information in order to make sure that I'm refining myself and I'm maybe
Mm.
rerouting some of the thought processes that I was once indoctrinated by in school, for example, or even the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years out of school. So I think for me, it's leaning into the confident humility piece has really been the catalyst to try to be a critical thinker within the clinical context. And then maybe if I add a little bit more into that, Noah, it's like having like this insatiable desire to want to grow, right? Like this curiosity that I'm always kind of ruminating over things at a deep level, um, just because it's fascinating to me
Mm.
to be able to like not only understand the surface level, but try to like double click, zoom in, and extract a little bit more information. I think that range is quite helpful, and it's something that I would say has been beneficial for me so far in my career with respect to kind of just reading different sciences and trying to see how do these seemingly disparate sciences actually how are they interconnected, if you will. So
Mm,
maybe that's a lot right there, but I think those are the things that kind of like maybe define or illustrate who I am or who I want to be, um, with respect to like the future version of myself as a clinician.
mm. Were there any catalysts throughout your career, either like a certain clinical situation or an environment or people that you sort of drew from, whether it was that sort of insatiable curiosity or that humility mixed with confidence?
Ooh, man, that's a great one. It's always hard for me to try to like extract singular moments. I'll definitely give maybe one or two examples that I think are pretty potent for me. Um,
Hmm.
but I would say, like, to be honest, and I don't mean to say this as like a cop out, but I do think it's like it really is the amalgamation of all the experiences that really kind of like determine who you gradually evolve to become. Um,
I agree.
so I guess I would say early on, it's actually those experiences that made me stop and pause and have like some discernment. And for example, one of my first jobs out of PT school, I worked with a doctor of osteopathic medicine. And within his practice, there were just a few, I don't know, methods, means, just concepts or ways of practicing as a clinician that uh, I didn't necessarily prefer. Um, and what I didn't prefer about it was just like some of it didn't seem biologically plausible, if you will. And so for me, it was like, okay, well, what about it? This emotion that I'm having of maybe disinterest with respect to some of the teachings from this doctor of osteopathic medicine, like where are these emotions coming from? Okay, I'm not sure if these things are biologically plausible. So then I need to make sure that I take it upon myself to kind of do some research and investigate and kind of determine what the opposing view is. And that's when I kind of got into the readings of like Greg Lehman, if you will, and The Science of Pain, David Butler. And so I started to kind of veer into that. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of continue to expand my acumen and aptitude for sport, physical
Mm-hmm.
therapy. And so I was kind of reading individuals in that world. And so kind of like merging both of those two together was really beneficial as I took my next job at a company called Rehab to Perform out in Maryland. And so I would say it's like that first job where it was like this friction, if you will, was this catalyst towards like being able to truly like expand and evolve. But it took a lot of like intentional reflection, because a lot of times we have things that just happen to us, but we still have agency over how we are going to accept or not the environment that we're in. And so for me, I
Mm.
didn't think that I was evolving to the clinician that I wanted to be. Um, and I was uncertain again just about some of the concepts that maybe the clinic that I was in would be espousing to the patients. So a lot of it was me taking the onus and the ownership to really try to investigate a little bit further. And I think that's the key point there too, is like the discernment and being very intentional about like pausing, if you will, to truly determine what are uh, the the opposing views and the critiques and criticisms of what you're learning. I think it just makes you a more well-rounded person who has range, so you can kind of
Mm-hmm.
navigate the turbulence of day-to-day clinic of what you're going to see from patients, what you're going to hear from patients. So that was super, I think, critical in who I currently am today.
Very cool. And I know that you sort of, at least from the outside, it seems as if you have a lot of comfort with seeing different sides to the arguments And I think a lot of that, again, going back to the confidence and humility idea, probably comes from your understanding of principles over concepts. And you've sort of expanded on those thoughts before. Principles over methods. And I know that when it comes to the method, sometimes we may have like very specific, narrow ways of thinking about things. Like there's one right way to approach things, and you're more so principle focused, allowing you to sort of deal with a little bit more uncertainty. And I think you apply great principles when it comes to the common debate, which is what we're here to talk about today, of functional versus non-functional exercises. So before we get into the actual debate itself, could we actually define those terms? Like, what does that actually mean? How would you define functional versus non-functional?
Yeah, for sure. Great, great question again. And just to preface, like you said, I'm glad you put that little contingency there. This is my definition that is assuredly something that is impeachable, right? And people can kind of come up with their own definitions of it. But, my worldview that allows me better sense making would say that the operational definition of functional is any activity that reduces constraints and enhances boundaries. Now, Noah, what I used to have, though, is maybe a little bit more. And in retrospect, I don't know if it was appropriate to have the rest of the definition. So I'll tell you what the rest of the definition was, and we'll start from the beginning again, is any activity that reduces constraints and enhances boundaries, increasing the potential to improve performance of a task. But what I did is say, well, increasing the potential to improve the performance of a task might not be necessary in order for something to rise to the level that we deem functional. So, for example, if we think of a constraint as anything that limits the boundaries or configurations or possibilities of an output, or even the input, and I'll get to that point in a second, then it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is a particular performance or a task. So let's take, for example, someone who wants to get stage ready and they're for a bodybuilding competition, right? And that's one of their biggest constraints that they've received feedback for is their biceps, right? Or the lack thereof, right? They just don't have enough size and hypertrophy. So what would be maybe the most functional route to have an improvement of the size of the biceps would be just direct tissue loading, bicep curls, if you will, different iterations of that. But how can we maybe direct the stimulus or stress directly towards where it needs to go? I think something like a bicep curl, we could deem that as being quite functional, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a performance that is necessitated by that. So that's why I took off the rest of that definition and said, well, this is just something that reduces the constraints or enhances the boundaries. Again, isolated bicep curls can be functional contingent on whether or not it's relevant to that individual's goals. And so to your point, I think in the past, and probably still to this day, we make things very dichotomous, very binary, black or white. Whereas, things that would be deemed as non-functional are things that usually lack kinematic relevance and biomechanical representation to the terminal task that is the sport, right? So if it's something that limits their degrees of freedom, that seems to be very restrictive and isolated, doesn't have a lot of interjoint cooperation or coordination, we view that, generally speaking, as something that is lower utility within physical preparation, physical performance. And I think a lot of times that comes from, the premise that we need to be recreating some of these more chaotic, representative types of tasks. But unfortunately, I think that blinds us to the credence behind isolated activities. And we start to put on like this thought process that and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is that not everything is, and most things aren't, I would say, exercise dependent, right? We have like an exercise dependent worldview as opposed to an adaptation driven worldview. And so if
Mm,
we can understand what drives the adaptations, right, and the underpinning constituents of the specific adaptations, then you can come up with any number of different exercises. But we typically view the intervention first through the lens of, well, what's the most appropriate exercise? Well, it doesn't matter yet, because I need to discern what is the adaptation. And how do I do that? Well, I need to understand what the constraint is. And how do I determine what the constraint is? It's by having the conversation with the athlete, with the patient, understanding their sport, their task, what it is that maybe they don't possess, that they need to have a restitution of, to augment something, or they need to have the affordance of to maybe protect a particular joint from some type of stress or strain. So
mm,
for me, going back to your original question, functional is, it can be anything that again helps to reduce those constraints or whatever limits the degrees of freedom or the boundaries, and then something that actually enhances their boundaries. It gives them a broader uh, a broader affordance landscape, if you will, where an
mm.
affordance is just anything that the environment allows for action to take place. And so if we have more affordances, there's more options and opportunities that are perceived by the organism. And then there's likely more solutions that are available and viable options as well.
Right. Okay. I think your definition does a really good job of taking out this false dichotomy between non functional and functional exercises. And it helps to think about what our actual goal is, and then whether or not whatever modality we're choosing can actually help get those adaptations or derive those adaptations to match our goal. I think that dichotomy, the false dichotomy that a lot of people have when it comes to functional versus non-functional exercises, is that they, as you said, think that a functional exercise should look like the end stage task. So if it's a basketball player, which you're very well acquainted with, then the exercises that we give should look like the end stage task, and exercises that don't look like that, like a biceps curl, maybe because it's so constrained, it doesn't really mimic a lot of things on the basketball court, or a leg extension and hamstring curl. Those things we should sort of like chuck aside because they don't really look like basketball. What's what's with the what is there harm in only thinking about how something actually looks and how it relates to the end stage task?
Oh, without question. I mean, I think you nailed it too with respect to how it looks. Again, it really is the term that I like to use that really resonates with me is this kinematic representation, where maybe we have an underappreciation of the kinetic profile. And so if we only do things that are uh, solely integrated, non-constrained tasks that we would deem as functional, or a lot of the movement world would deem as functional, we might leave athletes left with immature capacities, and or immature structural load bearing capabilities or tissues, right, from a
Mm,
morphological or architectural standpoint. Because a lot of times some of these more integrated, non-constrained activities might not deliver a high potency of stress and strain, meaning they fail to saturate the tissue to a high fidelity, where the morphological or the architectural changes don't occur. So if I can give maybe an example here, let's say someone has a biceps femoris strain, and we won't get into like the specific nuance of the grade of strain and all this, but let's just say they have a hamstring strain, and we are pitted between performing a single leg RDL to acquire restitution of the structure and the neuromuscular force generating capacities of that hamstring, or something that's more isolated, like a seated hamstring curl. I would I would speculate that a large proportion of our colleagues would say, "Hey, we're going to go with the single leg RDL because it is seemingly more similar to maybe a hamstring strain occurrence, biomechanically speaking, particularly if it were like a stretch mediated hamstring strain, which I know usually happens more to like the semimembranosus, but um, let's say they chose that. Okay, we want to make sure that this person can be able to tolerate their center of mass moving forward, and they're getting that strain and stretch on the hamstring. So we're going to go that route. Now, that's not incredibly inappropriate. I think there's utility there with respect to being able to navigate and manage your center of mass on one limb. And so I like that from a coordinative perspective. And yes, there is going to be true load that's being received and seen from that tissue. However, going back to what you stated and what you asked about what's maybe the downside, what's the trade-off, it is the ability to navigate oneself and to stabilize oneself effectively so that I can actually extract the most from that exercise might be blunted, as opposed to getting into a seated hamstring curl machine, especially, which I would be a proponent of isokinetically. I am able to promote these structural, meaning architectural changes, because I can make sure that the centric velocity for that exercise is a little bit more potent. So now I get these fascicle changes and adaptations, which we know can help out with affording protection. But I can also make sure, just in general terms, that the hamstring is just receiving the necessary stimulus in order to promote neuromuscular adaptations, and making sure that that is the tissue that is not only receiving the stress but producing the output, right? So it's getting the input, which is one thing. It needs to get input to have those structural changes, but I want to make sure that it's the thing that's engendering the neuromuscular output as well. Because if I'm doing a single leg RDL, there could be a chance that there is this intra-limb compensation that's happening, similar to ACL reconstruction, right? A single leg squat, for example, where maybe the knee is less involved and it's the ankle or the hip that's taking more ownership. So the same could be true for a single leg RDL. And so to me, it's understanding, again, what are the adaptations that I'm seeking, as well as what are the trade-offs, what's the upside, what's the downside, and what are the capabilities of the athlete to load that exercise in an appreciable manner to derive the necessary stress to start to signal that particular adaptation.
Right. I'm glad that you started talking about compensations there, because that it leads me into my next question. Some people may be on board and now they fully understand this debate between non-functional and functional exercises, and that sometimes you're trying to pick the exercise that's best suited to drive adaptation, even if it doesn't look like the end stage task. But for the critics out there, for the skeptics, what would you say to someone who would ask, why do we need to actually get on a hamstring curl machine? Couldn't we just allow for that hamstring strain to recover and then get them to slowly ramp up their basketball activities? And then that will load the hamstring a little bit, maybe not the most effective way possible, but if they just continue playing basketball, maybe they'll get to the point where their hamstring is doing everything that it needs to do.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that's a very common. I don't want to say debate, if you will, something that prompts a lot of judicious discourse, right, between colleagues. And while I think it definitely has credence in its proposition, what I typically lean towards is whether or not something is, with decision making, safe to fail. And so, what I mean by that, there are certain injuries where, let's say, it's a grade one ankle sprain, for example. This might be something that, and it's this athlete's first time ever having a grade one ankle sprain. And again, what I'm about to say can be contextualized, certainly, but maybe this is something that is a little bit more safe to fail with respect to not restoring the isolated tissue's capacity, meaning the peroneal musculature. Okay, so we can kind of just let more of the integrated, dynamic interjoint exercises take over. When it comes to maybe something like the hamstring, or these things that kind of have a longer time loss and there's more degradation of that tissue, I want to increase the odds and increase my confidence that I'm actually ensuring that particular tissue or joint is increasing its contribution or possesses its ingredients to contribute to the final recipe. Because sometimes what happens is when we get to these things that are very close to the terminal task, all the ingredients are now mixed up. And so it's hard to truly determine whether or not we've actually improved that quality, that capacity, that capability. And I think we can have a lot of false negatives with respect to, they can sprint now, so they're good. But again, the sprinting is just this emergent output, this emergent property that I'm sure there are many of athletes who could return back to sprinting without necessarily having reacquired the biceps femoris structural changes or neuromuscular profile. And they're probably doing so by shifting load to alternate regions, right? Say the adductor magnus, for example, very potent load sharing tissue, kind of the synergistic accommodation strategy. But what happens is that we don't think of the second order consequences to that, which is, what's the consequence of the consequence? Well, the consequence of allowing them to just get back into sprinting and doing nothing that is in isolation, like a seated hamstring curl, is that there is a higher probability that they have a recurrence of the hamstring strain, and or an alternate region exceeds its envelope of function because it's taxed with doing more than what it had done in the past. And we didn't necessarily account for that. And so I think, my stance would be merging and marrying both of those concepts, where it's kind of like this, you're concomitantly doing isolation as well as integrated work across the continuum of manipulating force and time. So I think that's maybe the best of both worlds, where it doesn't have to be binary. To your point, it doesn't have to be either or. My main proposition and what I'm trying to contest is that we could do a better job of maybe appreciating the upside to the isolated activities, and also recognizing the downside for omitting them in service of solely integrated, seemingly similar kinematics as the sport itself.
That was beautifully put.
I appreciate it.
I think a lot of those people, those skeptics, the hypothetical ones, they've probably come around at this point based off of that answer.
We'll see. I'm sure. And look, no, I'm sure there are holes and gaps in there as well. And I'm always, ready to kind of reconsider and rethink things for sure. Because I will say this too, admittedly, there was a time where, it's kind of like this curve where you're like, okay, no, everything has to be this way with respect to, integrated, non-constrained exercises that look just like the sport. And then you kind of shift away and you adopt a different worldview. And now that becomes your approach. And then finally, you start to recognize, well, why do I have to have this binary bias, and why can't I appreciate and contextualize when and why and how all of these different methods would be viable options. And they all are,
Mm.
because, as you said, it's principles over methods first. So if I understand the principles and I know what the key determinants are for that particular sport or that athlete, then I think that gets me to a more satisfying solution.
Hmm. Can I take you through my own curve when it comes to ACL rehab and just hear
Oh,
your
I would
thoughts
love
on
that.
it?
I would love that.
So I worked in a sports medicine clinic for the first 2 years of my career, and saw a lot of ACL patients. And at first, I would commonly think about their end stage task. Let's say it's basketball. Let's say they just want to get back to running. Usually, they had a sport that they wanted to get back to, and pretty early on, I would have that in mind, and then think of movements and exercises that resembled that. And maybe for a basketball player, as soon as they could comfortably tolerate it, it was a side shuffle, right? Or maybe I would try and get them to start jumping. I knew still at the time that oftentimes the limiting factor or the main constraint would be their ability to load the anterior knee. A lot of the time, that would sort of impair the kinematics. So I would look at how they're moving, and then I would try and cue them out of it. Then I started to listen more to people like Eric Mera and Chris Juno, and talking about how realistically the way that they're moving like that is because of that limiting factor. So therefore, you should focus more on restoring the qualities of the knee extensors, the knee extensor mechanism, to allow people to then take that improved tissue quality or the improved ability to flex the knee under load, whatever it may be, and then take that to their movement. And then I maybe held off on some of the side shuffles and some of the jumping, when maybe I could have still introduced it early on. And now I'm at a place where I see the value of both. But sometimes I wonder, when is the best time to start incorporating some of these more complex movements? And is there a downside in focusing on those too early, when maybe you could just be doing isolated knee extensor, quad exercises?
Yeah, I'm writing because I just took some notes on kind of what you were saying. Yeah, man, that's really, I really appreciate you going through that kind of reverse engineering your thought process and your kind of like matriculation, if you will, to where you are currently. I think there's a lot of shared similarities between us. Um, I'm definitely going to get to your question. I'll see if I can kind of link in some things of just a few things that I just jotted down from what you explained. And
Mm.
a lot of it to me, like the two words that I just kind of like thought of were how were redundancy and degeneracy. And so there's a lot of redundancy and degeneracy within the human body, meaning we can derive so many different solutions to answer a movement question.
Mm.
And that's the beauty of being, humans, and being able to find different movement solutions, movement answers for some of these questions that we're taxed with. Um, there's this thing called the bliss of motor abundance, right? It's blissful. It's like, man, there's an abundance of different motor programs and patterns that are available to us. But the challenge becomes when we kind of perpetually rely on one kind of set, and maybe one of two things I think about happen when we constrain the motor abundance that we have, meaning we constrain the amount of solutions that are available. We either don't distribute work across multiple tissues or joints. And so now there's going to be a cumulative aggregation of mechanical stress that eventually outpaces the remodeling of that tissue. And now we see that there's degradation to that tissue, or it can't service the demands that are required by the sport effectively. And so that can eventually have this emergent manifestation as pain or injury or fatigue or what have you. But then, and that's from like a more of a affording protection standpoint. And then we think about the other thought process is it doesn't always allow us to augment performance. Because again, going back to the affordance landscape, I want to have many different solutions, and the affordances that the environment gives me is going to be based off of the perception action coupling together. So, for example, an NBA player who has great internal capabilities, meaning they don't have many constraints to their internal knee extensors moment, like they can decelerate pretty effectively and skillfully to where they're able to make sure they evade the defender, create space, and now this gives them the ability to get off their three. And it all hinges on the affordance opening up because they possess the ingredients at the quad. But if they didn't have that, that would now shrink their affordance landscape, and they wouldn't have that as a viable option. And so they would then need to do something else, and that would negatively influence their performance. So so going back, I'm trying to create this story, but like redundancy, degeneracy, we got the affordance landscape. And now we say, all right, well, when in reconditioning and rehab, or even in performance, a lot of times what we want to do is actually try to temporarily reduce someone's degeneracy or redundancy so that there's an eventual improvement in it. It's just temporary, right? And so to your point, and I wrote this down, that the kinematics are the unfavorable kinematics are an expression of the immature kinetics. Okay. And so if I can
for people that get confused between kinematics and kinetics, could you say that in another way?
Yeah, for sure. So I think of it this way, because a lot of times kinematics are like spatial temporal, and kinetics are kind of force generating constituents. But I just kind of put it this way. I look at kinematics in this term as the shapes and positions that the athlete can acquire and get into. And then the kinetics as the force profile, right? So how are they manipulating their mass in motion? Okay, their momentum, if you will. And so if I know that typically, and it's a byproduct, bidirectional influence, that the kinematics are oftentimes a result of the kinetics. And even if it is the flip as well, where yes, sometimes the kinetics are a result of the kinematics, we have more of an ability to manipulate the kinetic profile more than we, I think, do the kinematic piece. Yeah. And so when you ask the question of, well, at what point of the reconditioning process do we start to add in some of these more emergent, reflective of the task-oriented drills? I would say it all is going to be contingent on what is the rate limiter or the trainable deficit that we're trying to acquire. So let's say it's the knee, for example, and it's ACL reconstruction. And we know that we want to expand their affordance landscape, but in order to expand it, we have to first reduce it, and we have to constrain that joint. And early on, maybe we want just, to reroute arthrogenic muscle inhibition. We want to make sure we have a hypertrophy to kind of like circumvent the atrophy. I probably want to constrain it. And there's not a ton of these very emergent tasks that I'm going to do. But eventually, once I kind of get past that and I start to say, all right, we want to get more to like max strength, if you will, or sub max strength. And we're going to do things that have that require you to recruit motor units at a high magnitude. Once they get into that phase, while those things have high forces, they have high forces over a longer duration, right? So it's not temporally constrained. Then I would say, well, now we can start to, in parallel with those types of constrained loading vehicles, I'm going to start to have them do things that are more emergent, but it's all based on how I manipulate impulse and how I manipulate momentum, right? So I would never ask someone to do a very dynamic effort forward lunge right when they are starting in isolation with some type of heavy leg press, if that's their first exposure, right? Heavy single leg press where they're trying to get maximum muscle strength. They probably haven't done anything where they're getting explosive strength that requires force to be produced fast or in a short amount of time. And so if I understand where they are on this impulse momentum type of trajectory, then I can pair the thing that looks like the sport with the thing that's in isolation to make sure that I don't surpass their capabilities or their qualities. But once they start to get to these things that are, okay, now we're in explosive strength and we're hitting ballistic, pushing isometric muscle actions for the quad, right? Where I want you to be able to reach this peak in a condensed amount of time. Now we can probably start to do these forward lunges that have a speed element to it, where my control of my center of mass is really quick, and it's going to require this very rapid internal knee extension moment to be able to navigate that external knee flexion moment, but again, in a quicker amount of time. So that would be maybe my thought process. And again, it all goes back to, once I can do that, now on court, I have so many different solutions and my landscape is so much richer because I initially constrain things in order to open up things.
It sounds like you're even thinking about what you're constraining at each stage in that rehab process. So you're thinking about their ability to produce a lot of force quickly as something that may hold them back in doing these more quote unquote functional movements if they aren't used to that yet. So you actually train that a little bit first before asking them to say, okay, now let's do a sort of like a deceleration lunge, right?
Absolutely, exactly. That's well put. That's kind of exactly the premise in which I usually abide by. Is that a lot of the things that we presume we can only do in these more integrated, dynamic activities, we can actually also do in isolation as well, right? Like someone can get on a leg extension machine and do very like explosive types of contractions, like concentric contractions to help out with the rate at which they produce force, and making sure that the torque is coming from the knee joint, that the contractile tissue that is producing that output is coming from the quadriceps musculature. So that when, again, we put that into the rest of the algorithm, right? Or we put it in with the rest of the ingredients, if we're going with this kind of recipe analogy, we know that it's there, that it's available. But if I never do that in isolation, it might be challenging for me to deduce whether or not that ingredient is in the final recipe. And I might just say, oh yeah, it's there, it's available, but it might not be. And they might still be successful at the task, but again, they're successful because of the redundancy with other joints, whether it's interlimb or interjoint compensations that are occurring.
And again, the concern with that is that theoretically their injury risk may be a little bit higher if they load the unprepared tissue in a way that they haven't, or if they overload the tissues that are compensating.
100%. Yeah, exactly. Those are kind of like the thoughts that I have. And then again, from the performance standpoint, not only from the injury piece, it is something that might shrink or reduce the landscape at which I can function, because now I don't perceive certain affordances that once used to be available to me.
Right. Right. So then in terms of performance and injury risk, when it comes to these more complex, again, quote unquote, functional exercises, how like other people typically refer to them, not necessarily how we've been discussing them today. Maybe these more, complex movements, things that look way more similar to on-court work if we're using basketball as an example. Why do that? Is that so just that the athlete can practice again? Is it to drive any sort of adaptation? Is it mostly skill based? Is there an injury reduction standpoint to it?
Yeah. Um, it's probably a mixture of all of those. And I would say it's important to think about the opportunity cost, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's important, and the opportunity cost with that comes making sure like we're really taking this cautionary approach to some of these more nuanced and novel types of exercises. And drills or solutions, whatever we want to call them. But I think, for me, the opportunity cost is about the time as well as the fidelity of the exercise. So particularly, in basketball, right, when I'm seeing an athlete, time is not just ever going, it's finite. Like we have a certain amount of time that is available. And so we have to make sure that we are relatively streamlined in what it is we're trying to resolve or what it is we're trying to improve to make sure that we're opening up their boundaries. So let's say I did one of these exercises that had a lot of different components with it. I would
Mm-hmm.
have to ask myself, well, what am I missing out on by doing this? What is the opportunity cost of this exercise or drill or activity? And does it actually outweigh and have a higher upside than the thing that I'm leaving off of the table and decided not to do? So I think of
Mm-hmm.
that. And then the other two things, Noah, that I think about is what is the reversibility and consequentiality of choosing those more nuanced and what I would deem as like typically more superfluous exercises. Well, it is, yeah, a lot of those things, they're reversible. Like I could say, all right, well, I could do something completely different if it didn't give me the adaptations. But again, it goes back to time pressure that we typically don't have the luxury of. If I've spent 2, 3 sessions and those sessions were 30 minutes or so each, now I've wasted an hour and a half. And so I can eventually
Mm-hmm.
reverse it and choose a different route to proceed in the future. But again, I've failed to maybe deliver a potent type of intervention. But then the consequentiality piece is what are the second order consequences? How is this consequential to what it is we're trying to develop and resolve from a trainable deficit perspective?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, some of these things that have many different components have a lot of consequences that come with them. And the consequences, we continue to have a player have immature and underdeveloped kinetic profiles and or architectural morphological adaptations. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is something that um, is almost deemed as being uh, just a route that you don't want to go down with an athlete, because again, they want to get out there and be the best version of themselves. So maybe it is similar to some degree as like negligence, if you will. And so again, I think of like the consequentiality, reversibility as the two big things, and the second order consequences as well as the opportunity costs. And if I could say one more thing, a lot of those
Yeah.
have competing demands. Like they have competing. It's like too many stressors at once, and so the signal gets lost. And so the system that we're trying to adapt might not actually receive an appreciable or stimulative type of input to have it adapt, whether that's sensory, motor, neurocognitive, whether that is from a tissue structural standpoint, such as tendons, where we want to have mechanical strain for those adaptations, or whether it is from the mechanical tension of a contractile tissue if we want hypertrophy. If we're throwing so many different things simultaneously with one exercise, well, where's that intended stimulus going to go? It's so many things. It's that are competing with each other that nobody wins. The analogy is kind of like, two cars, one on each side, playing chicken, right? So they're coming at each other, and it's like, well, if one doesn't veer off, both end up losing. And so I think, that's kind of the metaphor that I would use for some of these exercises that just involve so many different components at play where nobody wins and everybody loses, and it was a waste of time and it was a big opportunity cost.
Yeah. So then applying all of that to the real world and coming from, I guess, the audience's perspective or the sports fans' perspective, when a player gets injured in the NBA, you hear that so-and-so player has now begun doing on-court work. Or like now they're doing one-on-one, they started participating in full contact practice, whatever it may be. Under your belt, would it be safe to say that if a player has started to resume on-court work, that's not coming at the cost of restoring whatever it is that we're trying to restore in the reconditioning process? Or are they already at a point where those tissues have been reconditioned and they could start now expressing that sort of their regained ability on the court?
Yeah, I love that one. That's great, man. So I would say I think of that as understanding the sport first. So basketball is an invasion, but also an evasion sport as well. A lot of times we only think of it as invasion. We're trying to invade someone's space so that we preclude them from scoring, or we're trying to evade someone from an offensive standpoint to create separation in space and have more solutions available to increase our odds of scoring. So it's invasion and evasion. Invasion and evasion is typically predicated on the manipulation of one's own motion or their mass, which really is just momentum. Momentum is mass times velocity. So if I can manipulate my momentum, then I can either create better separation or evade someone, because now I have the ability to decelerate, throw the defender off. But I also, on the flip side, if I can change my momentum, I have a better ability to invade someone's space as well by accelerating my mass. And so first, understanding the sport. So we have those two things. And if we think about the evasion piece, a lot of times it is trying to like accelerate away, but it also has some deceleration. And then the opposite is true for invasion. And so those both are going to necessitate impulse. Okay, so impulse is going to be force times the integral of time. And so there's either impulse can be derived by peak, rate, or duration. Typically in sport, we're not looking for duration because it's such a temporally constrained activity where things happen at such a very quick instance of time that I want to leverage that. And so usually we're towards the peak and rate
Unless that sport is arm wrestling, right?
Exactly. That's a good one. That's very true. So then what we do is we say, okay, well, if we know that it's an invasion sport, we know that we need to manipulate our momentum. The way in which we do that is through impulse by applying force, and we apply force over a duration of time. And we know that it's usually by peak and rate. Peak and rate typically are going to have more strain and stress to the tissues. Now we can say in mechanical loading, now we can say, well, if they're back on court and this is maybe like their first session back on court, I'm going to try to talk to player development coach coaches to derive a session that actually allows the player the ability to extend the runway, so to speak, so that we can leverage more of the duration side. We can leverage more of the duration side of manipulating impulse, and we can spread out or distribute the work. And there's less need to have this invasion or evasion happen so abruptly, where we're getting these high spikes in stressors. And as we see them start to develop and evolve those constituent pieces in the training room or in the weight room with respect to rate of force and peak forces, now we start to say, all right, and we have proxies for being able to determine that. With respect to testing in a more sterile sense, then that gives us more confidence to say, hey, let's open up these new parameters on the court to give them the exposure to exploit these affordances. And those are typically going to be, again, mediated by the time piece of the impulse equation. So that's maybe a long answer there to say that what they're typically doing on court should be in conjunction with not only how the tissue is healing and behaving, but also how the outputs from a neuromuscular perspective are being engendered and reacquired.
Yeah. It sort of sounds like what you're seeing in the training room and wherever you do rehab is helping to sort of set up what they could do on court, and not so much vice versa. It's not as though, I guess maybe you do sometimes see problems that they have on court, and then you have to sort of explore a little bit more in the training room or in the rehab room as to why that's happening, right?
Yeah, for sure, 100%. I think in a case of a reconditioning, long time loss, to your point, it is often going to be predicated on training room or weight room that's maybe influencing and nudging the system in a certain direction for the court. But when it comes to just physical preparation and trying to augment someone's performance and get a little bit more like nuance, then it is reciprocated from player development and what's seen on the court and watching film to say, all right, how can we maybe make some advancements in expanding this player's capabilities, or they're having some challenges here. Again, how can we double click and zoom in and maybe determine what the rate limiter is, what the constraint is, what is the trainable deficit that maybe we can actually moderate, if you will.
Cool. I don't want to eat up too much of your afternoon, and I'm worried because I feel like we could talk about this all day.
Oh, we definitely can.
Do you have time for a couple more questions, Sher?
Without question. Yeah, I definitely do.
I'm thinking about the contrast between an NBA player and maybe someone that you would call a weekend warrior. And I'm thinking that the NBA player, it's their job. And throughout the whole reconditioning process, as long as it's not taking away from that reconditioning, that they'll work on their skills and they'll be able to express whatever they're getting from the training room into their sport. But I think about maybe the weekend warrior who's just coming to a physio clinic and their long-term goal is to play basketball, and they don't really have a lot of opportunities to do that outside of the physio clinic, just because maybe of how their life is set up. Maybe it's the winter and they're nervous about playing basketball on their own. They don't have a trainer with them. They don't have their rehab professional with them. Do you feel like in those instances, there's maybe more value in incorporating some of these more complex exercises into their rehab? Or are you still pretty concerned about the opportunity cost when it comes to, now that we're doing these more complex tasks, we can't get as much of the desired adaptations that are ultimately, perhaps at this point in the rehab process, the most important things to focus on?
Yeah. I think that's a great one to have some contextualization over.
Yeah.
And I would say yes for this weekend warrior. Presumably, they, based on kind of like what you manufactured for this individual, like they would need a little bit more of these integrated kind of complex, and when I say complex, not necessarily these things that are having so many different competing inputs, but just complex from a standpoint of uh, many joints cooperating together to complete a task.
Right.
That they could probably leverage that a little bit more because they don't get the exposure at the same frequency uh, or magnitude, but particularly frequency as an NBA player does. And so I think leveraging that could be helpful to allow them the ability to navigate and negotiate just their body in space. I know that is sometimes nebulous and ambiguous for when I say that, like, what does navigating and negotiating your body in space mean? What does it matter? I've had some judicious discourse with people about that in the past, but I do think that it's something that we just know when we see it, and obviously we all look through the world through a different lens. But I do think that just being able to move in space, if you don't get the opportunity to do so at a frequent kind of cadence as an NBA player, I think that could be really valuable, because not only does it help to bestow confidence in the isolated components and constituents that you're building on, but it also is a nice way to serve as like this lag indicator on whether or not the basal constituents or those underlying components are actually resolving themselves, because the person is going to be able to start to determine and discern whether or not they feel differently with those tasks. You can kind of watch and determine as well. Obviously you can use technology as well. You got all these technology is just advancing so fast where we can start to kind of like objectify joint angles and motion and moments, etc. But sometimes I don't think we even always need those things. And so for me, it's like it gives the patient, this weekend warrior, the confidence, but it also acts as like this ability to bridge this chasm between isolation and the emergence of sport, where we're kind of like in this middle ground where, again, it just serves as this lag indicator, where the lead indicator is more of the isolated actions and qualities and outputs that we can measure at times and determine what their torque or forces are. But it's like, well, then what does that do to the thing that is more closely or proximate to the emergent task? So I think it's kind of twofold with respect to what it can deliver, as opposed to maybe the NBA player. And the last thing too is that the weekend warriors' adaptive ceiling is a little bit lower than someone who's been doing the sport for years. And so they may not even need as much of the integrated task because they've probably done that so much throughout college, sometimes high school. And when you get into maybe some of these other programs, particularly in the NBA, where you are trying to leverage more isolated activities, those are the things that have a higher adaptive ceiling because it's novel to them. Their system hasn't been put in a constrained manner to be able to extract as much as it needs. And so if we go back to the weekend warrior, those are individuals who might not have done a lot with respect to like the integrated multi-joint compound exercises. And so their adaptive ceiling for being able to improve their coordinative cooperation there might actually be a little bit higher. So we can extract some tangible changes that way.
Oh, that's cool. That's very cool. It's almost like if we were comparing like a bodybuilder who's never played basketball in his life and like only does isolated joint movements versus the basketball player who's never really like lifted much before.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good analogy actually. Yeah, I think it's like just trying to recognize, and we won't ever really know. It'd be hard to maybe objectify, if you will, but like the adaptive ceiling of different individuals and or different tissues, different skills as well, where it's like, okay, like we've kind of saturated this quality or this capability. So now if we've checked that off, what's the next rate limiter, or what is a different quality that you want to advance or expand upon, this off season, if you will.
Right. Gotcha. Last question for you, Jared. A little bit away from everything that we've spoken about today. I think that recapped it pretty nicely.
Okay.
Unless you have any thoughts about that you just want to get out before we move on.
No, I'm good, man.
Cool.
You've been doing a great job. I feel like I've been just going on and on, talking too much. Hopefully, my message is able to land decently on some people.
I mean, hey, I'm with you. I mean, I've already learned a lot, and I think the other thing that I wanted to ask you that other people can learn from you is, I think you have probably a job that most people, it's their dream job when it comes to physical therapy, right? A lot of students, they go in school and they think about how cool it would be to work in pro sports. Do you just have any general advice for people that would want to follow in a similar path as you, whether it's about developing beliefs and character traits that we spoke about earlier, or maybe actionable things that they can do throughout their career?
Yeah, definitely. Um, you know, and I'm sure people get a lot of different feedback, which is fantastic. A lot of different advice and opinions that are out there, which I think is the beauty of it, because everyone's going to have their own path to get there. They're going to be coming in with their own set of circumstances where maybe a different piece of advice lands differently for them and more favorably. For me, I would say one of really the two biggest things, particularly coming from outpatient rehab, it goes back to kind of what we opened up with respect to confident humility, but particularly the humility piece is that, if you are coming into a high performance setting where you're working with a lot of different disciplines and departments and domain experts, it is incredibly essential to have humility, because of the fact that we usually, as physical therapists, would wear almost every hat in the clinic, and we would take the patient or the athlete that we're seeing from plinth to play, table to turf. We're kind of doing the totality of their programming. And so while that is certainly fun and you kind of get a lot of fulfillment from that and it's rewarding, once you usually get into this environment, especially the NBA, you're going to have different departments that are leveraging their unique capabilities and expertise and insights. And so being able to have enough humility to allow them to leverage those skill sets and making sure that we keep the main thing, which is the athlete being available, being ready, and servicing them, I think is incredibly important. I think, Ryan Holiday says it, but ego is the enemy. And so the antidote to that is having humility. And then maybe, the second piece of advice kind of correlates to this, if you will. And it is, while you have humility and letting people shine and leverage their expertise in their respective domains, it's also understanding that you don't have to just stay in your lane. So a lot of times people will say, "Oh, stay in your lane. This is kind of what you do." But I think it's important to make sure that you can speak different languages. You understand the perspective of different disciplines and professions. And so that means being able to, put on the turn signal and get in the left or the right lane. But I don't stay there for forever. I'm there just to kind of like reroute, move, get out of the way of traffic, and then I get back to my primary lane. But I need to be able to do that because that range gives me the ability to navigate chaos and be able to communicate and avoid challenges and issues, and whether it's traffic, whether it's an accident, etc. So it's the same thing with respect to this environment, where in order to avoid some of these hiccups and obstacles and roadblocks, I need to be able to speak the similar language as other disciplines, because that allows us to come together as a collective and help these athletes get to where they need to go, and determine ultimately like what is the most relevant rate limiter, right? What's the rate limiter or the trainable deficit that we believe warrants what warrants our attention and needs to be resolved, because it's going to have the biggest influence on all these other interconnected systems throughout the body. So I think those are the two biggest things. Now, those are just words. So it's like, well, what are the actions? Like, how do you actually improve your humility? How do you actually improve your ability to speak different languages? I think the humility piece in clinic is challenging, but it can be done. And that is by either reaching out to and talking to people that are other clinicians in your clinic, right? Just going through a case study, leveraging their insight, seeing what they would do, how they would maybe interface with that particular challenge or obstacle or patient that you've been seeing, with their frame of references can be quite helpful. But then also searching for intentionally people outside of the clinic as well, I think is a great solution to try to garner more humility, because you kind of like put yourself out there, so to speak, to see what an opposing potentially viewpoint is, and different interventions look like. So that's from the humility piece. And then when we get to being able to kind of like speak several languages, if you will, and understand different disciplines. And it's not necessarily that I have expertise in all of those different domains, because I'm not going to be the domain expert, but I want to like be able to know enough where I can deliver information and I can extract enough to know what it is that I need to do with the athlete. And I think that comes from maybe similar to the first one, talking to people who are in different disciplines, whether it's a sports scientist, whether it is a sports psychologist or strength coaches or a biomechanist. It's talking to people from maybe different domains, as well as being intentional about what it is that you're consuming from a standpoint of like information consumption, right? It's like, all right, well, let me kind of like intentionally curate my IG so that everyone that I'm following is not just going to be a physical therapist. It's going to be people from different disciplines. So now I can start to understand more of their worldview and improve my sense making. I think that is incredibly important. So those are really the two biggest things, Noah, that I would say can be quite favorable for someone who has aspirations for trying to get into high performance, in particular the NBA.
That's great, Jared. That's great. Do you have a reading list for people?
Oh yeah, I definitely do. I can definitely shoot that over to you. I would say like the reading list is so, man, it's like I've gone back and forth with that too, because it's like my reading list is relegated not just to like physical preparation and like clinical didactic, but it's also things that again are seemingly quite disparate and like disconnected from what we do, but they actually have a lot of corollaries and they influence, and a lot of it has to deal with like being able to like think more effectively and decision make, because everything we do is a decision. Even not doing something is a decision. And it's like, well, what was the process that led you not to do something or to do something? So I think being able to clearly make decisions is quite important. And there's so many different variables that go into whether or not we make a decision, what those decisions look like, and what the heuristics are that we're applying in life. So a lot of the things that I typically consume are relegated to like our cognitive biases, psychology, critical thinking, and then sociology as well, because we're dealing with people that are in the world. So we're dealing with their psychologies of people in culture and the environment. And so I think being able to blend all those things together is quite fascinating to me. And that is what we are as like, as clinicians. Like, we're not just like helping people solve movement problems per se, but we have to get down to like the true element of a human being in and of itself. And I think that helps us to foster these relationships that then acts as like this bridge towards helping nudge them to where they want to be and where they want to go. So I can definitely shoot you that over if you want to make that available to your listeners and subscribers. I would definitely love to.
Cool. I can maybe put it in the show notes. Is there anywhere that people could follow you, Jared, or contact you, or do you want to be more private?
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, Dr. J Fit Boyd on Instagram, and then Jared Boyd on LinkedIn. And right now, man, just trying to, I don't really post a lot on Instagram like I used to. Used to post like different exercises and like my thought process behind them, and I've kind of fallen off of that for many reasons. Mainly because I think that is somewhat saturated, and not to discredit anyone who's doing that, because I think that's very, very helpful. But I think, a lot of the people that I believe kind of follow me are younger clinicians, newer clinicians. And I think it's about like giving them some type of a framework for, again, like thinking, right? That's incredibly important. Thinking and decision making more clearly and principle led perspectives. And so a lot of the things that I am trying to do now are more so about like writing out what's in my head as opposed to just showing exercises. And if I do, I want to make sure I can contextualize it and add nuance. So that's kind of what I've been leaning into a little bit more as of late. It's just more writing. It's kind of, it's fun to me. It's kind of like liberating in a sense too. We can kind of get into this flow state. I think it slowly is improving my ability to communicate a little bit more effectively, though it's still something that I want to continue to improve upon. But writing kind of services a lot of different buckets. And, I think that's the space where people kind of can get a better grasp of, what some of my ideologies kind of look like when it gets into the space of movement.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I know on the Science PT, that website, there's a lot of your writing there, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah. I think that'll be where a lot of it is housed. For right now, we'll kind of see if there's anything else that develops in the future with different websites and individuals wanting to being willing to kind of like host and share some of my writings and work as well.
Very cool. Cool. Jared, I love the worldview. You said you want to hone your communication. I think that's noble, but also you have such an incredible ability to be so specific in how you explain incredibly complex topics. And I think it's very admirable. I think people can learn a lot from your writing and just continuing to listen to your podcast. So thank you for coming on today. I really, really, really appreciate it. I learned a ton, and I'm sure everyone else did as well.
I appreciate you, Noah. This was fantastic, man. Like you said, we could have kept talking for another hour. I'm sure of it. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it was. It's hard to cut it off sometimes, but that's a sign of a good conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Jared. Thanks again.
Thank you.